Alright, man. So at this point, we are pretty much through the bulk of the Asian swing on the tennis calendar. We are through Beijing, we are through Shanghai now. I think one more tournament in Tokyo, and then it's on to the European indoor hard courts. And with the stakes still quite high for certain players as far as year-end rankings, whether that be making Turin or finishing world number one in the case of Djokovic and Alcaraz, as well as some pretty, banner results for certain players during the course of the fall so far. I've got a couple takeaways in this post US Open fall season thus far. Obviously, whenever you assess this part of the season, you always want to be a bit wary of not overreacting. As far back as I can remember as a tennis fan, it's just the time where wonky stuff is most prone to happen on the tennis calendar. But nonetheless, I think enough has happened so far this fall to come away with some significant takeaways. The first thing I'm going to talk about really just stems from my experience of watching Shanghai, and that is that I do not like 2-week Masters. I'm aware that this was a thing earlier in the year with Madrid and Rome also being stretched to 2 weeks, and the ATP moving forward with Canada and Cincinnati also becoming 2-week Masters after the Olympics year next year. But I came away watching Shanghai with a lot of the same feelings that I had watching Madrid and Rome debut as 2-week Masters earlier this year. Let me just start from strictly the fan perspective. I'd imagine whether it be watching from afar on TV or something like that, or being in person, a 2-week Masters just isn't favorable. From the viewing experience, I feel like adding more matches just by virtue of having the bigger draw, more players allowed to compete in it, that doesn't necessarily equate to better quality, better matches. I think a lot of the days it kind of just felt like fluff. And obviously that's not to disparage some of the guys that you wouldn't consider your box office top players. Especially as someone, as a tennis fan who, as I've gotten older, I've become more familiarized, more acclimated with the ranks, 50 through 500. But just stretching out these tournaments more just felt like it took a little bit of juice out of the event. And additionally, as somebody that has attended a Masters 1000 in Cincinnati for pretty much every one of the last 15 years, I feel like some of the charm of these tournaments would be lost to an extent, in the sense that when you attend these tournaments, particularly before the final weekend with semis and finals, you typically have so much choice at your disposal and, so many marquee matchups that are going on at the same time all over the grounds, to the point where you could catch one of these big names not on a stadium court, and it makes for an absolutely electric atmosphere. And I would imagine that some of that will be lost, considering you're having each half of the draw playing every other day, as opposed to with 1-week Masters, from round of 16 on, everybody is playing every day. So those are just my gripes as a fan. I do understand that logistically, it just makes sense for, the tour, with more players being able to be in the draw, more matches, more attendance equals more revenue. But additionally, the tennis calendar is already so packed. I would imagine some of the more fun, smaller events are going to be hurt once we get to a world where every Masters except for Monte Carlo and I believe Paris-Bercy are 2-week Masters. A lot of these smaller events probably are going to suffer. I don't know where you squeeze in a Washington DC or the post-Wimbledon clay tournaments if you've got both Montreal and Cincinnati as 2-week tournaments back-to-back. In my time as a tennis fan, Indian Wells, Miami have always been the 2-week tournaments, but I think those make the most sense as 2-week tournaments because it's been so long since we've had a major event in the Australian Open. It's been more than a month once Indian Wells starts. and it sprinkles in a couple of big prizes to basically close out the first third of the year. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents about the 2-week Masters. Not a fan, but it'll be interesting to see how that change evolves moving forward. But anyways, let's just get to the tennis. My second takeaway from this fall season so far is that it feels like 2024 could and should probably be Jannik Sinner's first that he's going to enjoy as a legitimate major contender for all 4 slams throughout the entire year. Jannik Sinner has checked a lot of boxes this season, finally conquered his first big title in Canada, made a maiden deep run at a major, making it to the semis at Wimbledon. And that aside, I think just eye test wise, you can see a lot of improvements in his actual game. A lot of the components of his game that are supposed to complement the main feature with the just dynamic power that he possesses, he seems to have made a concerted effort to get better at, whether it be the serve, the volleying, the touch. Probably not a finished product yet, but it's definitely gotten much better this season, more so than you could say that improvement for prior years. And I already thought that he had shown a great deal of improvement through the second half of last year. He's definitely carried that forward this year. In fact, in addition to that, he seems to have gotten much stronger. His endurance seems to be better, even though he has lost a good deal of just marathon, really heartbreakers this season, in the majors in particular. That aspect definitely seems to have been bolstered. And mentioning all those milestones he's achieved this year, probably his most impressive week of the season came in Beijing. He obviously took out the title there and did so the last 2 rounds, straight setting Alcaraz and Medvedev back to back. And the latter was probably the most impressive in defeating Daniil Medvedev, a guy who he had been 0-6 against coming into the final. And it's been well documented he struggled against the Medvedev and Zverev type, who are, tall guys that move incredibly well and excel in pace absorption. And it's felt like for a while Jannik Sinner just doesn't have a way through with just his line drive power against those guys. But in that final against Daniil Medvedev, he definitely went off script from how he's typically played him. Sinner employed a lot of the tactics that have become textbook to defeating Daniil Medvedev, but, that requires a skill set that you wouldn't typically associate with Jannik Sinner, being more willing to take the net, throwing different looks at him as far as paces and spins, and Sinner did it all to perfection, really, in that final. And in taking out the title, he rises to a career-high number 4 in the world, and I think all things are trending towards him being a formidable threat at every major next year, as opposed to coming into any season of his career to this point. And now let's take it from Jannik Sinner to who he downed in the semifinals in Carlos Alcaraz. And my takeaway, I guess, would be I'm not worried about Carlos Alcaraz. But more than that, I just want him noted here just to assess his season post-Wimbledon. After Wimbledon, I honestly thought Alcaraz finishing this season number 1 seemed like a bit of a formality, whether he won the US Open or not. And I thought he had a great shot at finishing this season with potentially double-digit titles. It really did seem like that kind of season. It was that kind of season through Wimbledon. It was just incredible production. He'd won 6 of the 10 events he'd entered, and he'd been to semifinals or better in 9 of the 10. Since Wimbledon, of course, he is titleless and already has failed to reach the semifinals of an event he enters to in the 5 he's played since Wimbledon, as opposed to 1 in the 10 events he played through Wimbledon. So obviously the incredible efficiency of that earlier portion of the season has not carried over to post-Wimbledon. And we've gone from titles in most of the events that he enters to a run of quarterfinal, final, semifinal, semifinal and round of 16 through Toronto, Cincinnati, the US Open, Beijing, and Shanghai. Which really is nothing to scoff at, especially given who his losses have been to. The worst being, Tommy Paul in Canada, where he was still super rusty, having not really played aside from Hopman Cup in between Wimbledon and Canada. And then Dimitrov in Shanghai, neither of which is particularly poor, especially given the context of rust in Canada, and then to this point, post-US Open tennis not really being his forte, albeit super early in his career. Throughout this stretch of tennis, I think two things have been very blatantly obvious. On one hand, Carlos Alcaraz has a really, really high floor. I think Cincinnati was the biggest display of this. Dropped a set in every single match, and you could argue throughout the week he was still at his B-C game throughout, excluding the final, of course, but against most opponents, even if they're playing at a very high level, like most of Alcaraz's opponents that week, he can still get away with it without having his A game. Just the combination of how mentally tough he is, how great a problem solver he's shown to be so early in his career, and of course the vast array of shots he has at his disposal. It can wriggle him out of trouble and, let him get by without playing his best stuff. On the other hand, I think that A game definitely has been vastly less present than it was through the earlier stretch of the season. That's been obvious for most to see. I think he was really good at the US Open and really good in the Cincinnati final, but surrounding that, it's kind of just meh. And even that being said, I think the root of what's going on with him, it's probably been the mental lapses. One blank midway through the Cincinnati final pretty much cost him that match. I said I thought he was really good at the US Open, and his loss to Medvedev's more marked up to Daniil playing one of the best matches of his life. I think just super unclutch for himself. You talk about the lapses, and after dropping the first set, he kind of just went away. He had a big letdown that saw him lose the second pretty easily. And then after that, it's just a really tough uphill climb against Daniil Medvedev on that court, down 2-0. Saw the same kind of lapse after he kind of stole the first set against Dimitrov in Shanghai. Threw in a clunker in the first game of the second. And as kind of a theme of this post-Wimbledon swing for him, a lot of the times he's given his opponents lifelines and they have made him pay for it. And in Beijing, of course, after he was up a break twice in the first, he went down pretty tamely after that first set. So, all in all, although flashing the A game much less often over this stretch, on one hand it hasn't been terrible, no really bad loss in there. The struggles on breakpoint and concentration lapses are things that were present also in Alcaraz's, funk per se last year as well after Wimbledon, even though the US Open win was sprinkled in there. This year, I think there could be a variety of factors contributing to this. He's been very open about his desire to end this year number one in chasing Djokovic. Maybe you can mark that up to, putting too much pressure on himself to close this year. It also wouldn't be foreign at all to have, a little bit of a hangover. Achieving that landmark victory over Novak Djokovic in a Grand Slam final on a court he hadn't lost on in 10 years in 5 sets. Whatever it is, I'm not too worried. I am excited to see how Alcaraz performs in his first appearance in Turin, assuming he stays healthy through the end of the year. But I'm not too worried about him. I think a clean slate in a new year will bring about the best in Carlos Alcaraz yet again. But then the last thing I want to talk about, of course, is the continuing trend of wacky stuff continuing to happen at the end of the season post-US Open. And in particular, I think this spot in the calendar really is retroactively kind of just hitting home again the insane consistency and greatness of Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer. Even my favorite player of all time, Rafael Nadal, my favorite athlete of all time, it's no secret that he dropped off a cliff almost every year. as far as his performance post-US Open. And while he is the most high-profile case, I do feel like a large amount of even the top players over the years have succumbed to similar symptoms of burnout, kind of. You know, to begin with, indoor hard courts are relatively sparse, and the biggest prizes on that surface come at a time where players probably are, itching to finish the year off. All the majors are in the rear view. Whether conscious or not, a lot of them do tend to ease their foot off the gas a little bit. And this year, that has been no different. Obviously, for some of these guys, the reasons aren't necessarily limited to just it being the end of the year, like Holger Rune, Felix Auger-Aliassime, who have been struggling for the past couple months. In Felix's case, going back to March, pretty much. Tsitsipas has been in a tailspin since taking out that Los Cabos title. Zverev looking gassed in his Shanghai opener. Fritz upset to Diego in Shanghai also came out of nowhere, especially for Taylor, someone who's going to be looking to pick up points, trying to make a push to Turin now, etc., etc. You get the point. You do have your usual suspects who do tend to, do well in conditions like these, like Medvedev, like Zverev. Sinner as well, not just the Beijing title. I believe he took out an indoor title in February as well, not sure which one, etc., etc. But the upsets definitely have persisted across the post-US Open swing this year yet again. Though, to be honest, the titleists in Sinner in Beijing, and now Hurkacz in Shanghai, not completely out of left field in comparison to some of the past runs we've had, like Jack Sock in Paris. Though very good players, the Dimitrov World Tour Finals in 2017 as well. Kachanov taking out the 2018 Bercy title in stunning fashion kind of came out of nowhere. And runs like that, results like that, really, in hindsight, coming back to Federer and Djokovic, the two best players in these conditions of my time watching the sport, it goes to show how ridiculous the durability, the fitness, the consistency was. Obviously, ever since those guys started cutting down their schedule a bit as they got older, and you no longer have the 6-time World Tour Finals champions or the Djokovic dynasty in Asia, as well as his dominance in Bercy as well. You strip that away, and over the last couple of years, and continuing into this year, where again we have an Asian swing, it's just continuing to amplify, one, how brutal the tennis calendar is, and two, just how rare and difficult it is to maintain just the top of the line presence throughout the entirety of it, basically 11 out of 12 months of the year. And Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic definitely the best at doing that I've ever seen. But with that, we are through the first half of the fall on the ATP Tour. As noted earlier, still got a lot to play for down the stretch with Bercy and the Tour Finals. A lot of people still looking to lock down those final couple spots in Turin. Novak Djokovic will be back in Bercy looking to seal year-end number 1 in that tussle for it with Carlos Alcaraz. So stay tuned for that. But that will do it for this video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like, help the video perform better in YouTube's algorithm, and also subscribe to the channel if you are not already. Thank you all again so much for watching, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.